Okay. So we had to cut it short last week based on, I was just on a roll and I lost track of time, but we have a lot more to talk about regarding the Communist Manifesto, and to sort of just like build me
Woo
back
woo.
up to where we were. I have the diagram that's on the screen right now, which is the economic base and the superstructure, and it just sort of like gives us a really nice sort of overview of like what's going on in Marx's mind when he talks about historical materialism. And
I love
so
this diagram.
of
I
interest
I
to
have a
us,
question about this actually.
yeah, sure.
Is this how it is or how it should be? This is how
This
it
is how it
is.
is.
Okay.
I'm driving, so I can't look at it, but would you mind giving us like a really quick
Yeah, it
synopsis of
went too
what it
fast.
says?
Yeah, I'm like really
Well,
So
confused.
I just didn't pay any attention last week, and I'm really excited we're back to this normal functioning.
one way
So I, yeah.
to approach this is to look at the top, the superstructure, which is on the top here, the
Okay.
everything that's above 50% of the line that we draw horizontally. Everything above here is the stuff we normally think is as important, is of importance to like a political science class or a philosophy class or
Okay.
sociology. Like we normally think of things like art and science and ideas and institutions and religion and what's the shape of the courts vis-a-vis the electorate, and is the military big or small. We normally think of those as important things, right, to discuss as like bedrock foundational things to discuss when we're trying to figure out what a society is about.
Okay.
But Marx is saying like, no, all that stuff is literally just there to maintain, to help us think, to reify, to make
Yeah, yeah.
real the real reality, which is underneath all that, which is basically just economics, which is basically, it's like the
Okay.
relations between the owners and the owned, who was working and who owns the factories. And so of importance to us of where we're going to go today is down here, the means of production, the instruments of production, the productive forces, the things that help us make stuff, right? The tools, the factories, the companies, the infrastructure, the technology. All of these things are down here, right?
Hmm.
Um, and as those things change, right, that stuff develops over time, right? We get better technology. We find out that, Moore's law or whatever, right? Like we get like a computer chip that can do twice as much
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
calculations
yeah.
in half the size. And what ends up happening when that happens is that ends up, influencing the ideas. Like it moves up. And so then we develop a new science based on, like, as a knock-on effect. Like we get new productive forces, we get a new economic reality, and that's when our stories change that we tell each other. That's when the family unit, starts to look differently. That's when we start to train or educate people differently. It's not the other way around. We don't like come up with an idea and then go and like make it real in the economy. Like it sort of happens naturally almost. And then that's when our sort of society changes. And so it goes in a wheel here. It goes in a sort of or in a clockwise wheel here. And then what I haven't discussed is down here in the bottom right. The best way to discuss this is what is the property relations, right? And so there's something different than the superstructure, which is the sort of the juridico-legal apparatus that's shaping the property relations. But the property relations are down there in the base. They're in the economic base. That's important. That's not just the superstructure stuff that's maintaining it. That's like the actual thing. What is the relationship between the land and who owns it?
Hmm.
Is there ownership of the land? Um, who's working it? Is it the same person working the land that who owns it? Or is there some sort of like relationship going on there where the person who's owning it doesn't actually have to do the work, and they, divvy up the process into a wage labor relationship? And so the bottom right, that's called the relation of production. So on the economic base, we have we have the productive forces, the means of production, right? The sort of instruments and technology and all that stuff. But we also have the relations of production, which kind of looks pretty societally. It kind of seems like it might belong up there, but it's actually, that's more fundamental than all that political science nonsense up there, right? And so though those relationships between each other, that relation in the base there, that makes up the economic base. And the economic base is the engine that churns history. It's not, we don't fight wars because of new ideologies, like the ideologies come about because the economic base has sort of, moved in that direction. So the important part here is that in the base, there's two separate parts. There's a productive force, the actual hard, like things that are tangible. You can knock on it because it's an actual instrument, versus the relations, the sort of like, the wage labor contracts, what's like, what is
Hey,
what's,
Brian, how would
yeah.
Marx classify like, I don't know, I don't know if this is the right term for it, but like intellectual labor, like, so like production that is non-tangible, that is necessary for innovation. Or actually, let's take it out of like my capitalist mindset, that the like, even like the intellectual labor that's necessary for like learning or teaching or academia.
Yeah, so he's it's a mistake to say that there's two great classes. There's the proletariat and the bourgeoisie.
Oh, really?
Obviously, throughout the manifesto in particular, he does say like we're tending towards that direction, but he does like he's aware that like there's multiple gradations in here. One of which is the intelligentsia. They're more often than not just instruments of the bourgeoisie. That's what Marx would say about the, they fulfill a useful and needed function for capitalism. Like they're not there.
So Marx would say that in an ideal society, we wouldn't like have people like you anymore, and we wouldn't have like teachers.
No, we might all be like me. No, like what he said. So you're wondering like what is like
like the mathematician, like that creates a new equation to like do something that's good.
Yeah, so like again, so this is very much like cookshops of the future. Marx does not want to write the recipe book for the cookshops of the future. That's like quoted from him. He doesn't know who's going to do what in communism.
Okay, got it. Okay, got it. So this whole concept of communism is like very unfinished and very like, it's not a complete, it's like, hey, here's this utopian idea. I don't really know if it's real or how to get there, or I don't really have all the answers, but at least here's like a cool idea. And I think
like,
it could
look,
really improve.
This diagram that we're looking at tells you why he's comfortable in that sort of unknowing what it's going to look like. He's like, why would I know what it's going to look like? Why would I know what it's going to look like? I'm living in capitalism.
Got it. Okay.
The clock has not turned towards where like my productive forces that I'm living under are tuned away from a profit motive that's all flowing towards a capitalist and tuned towards a societal thing. Yeah.
So would it be safe to say that while this is a noble ideology, the possibility exists, given his own concession that this is never, that he doesn't exist in that world, right? That the possibility exists that it's fundamentally impossible.
But it's impossible. Communism?
I'm okay with letting you have that one, but like, other people might have something. Jeff has had his hand up.
I just have a question because I was almost looking at communism through Marx differently.
Okay.
So I'm going back to the graph you had that went from like feudalism to whatever the fuck to capitalism. And I've been kind of listening to this, like Marx was trying to say that the natural progression or the natural antithesis of capitalism would be something like communism.
Yes.
And I guess I'm not even like looking at him like he's designing like a true economic system. I think I'm more looking at it like he's like anticipating the the next step in the chain of economic systems.
That's absolutely correct. He really wants to be the guy that is pointing out all the obvious flaws in capitalism that are going to get resolved this way. And he calls that this way communism. You know, he says like, look at this ridiculous thing that's going on. Look how amazing capitalism is at, you know, so like he spends a long time talking about how amazing capitalism is at producing stuff. But then he also, you know, he'll go on to talk about how it creates contradictions that it itself cannot solve. And we're going to get into all this. He does not want to sort of get into the discussion that I think we're having where it's like, well, what's possible, what's not. He's saying like, no, it's inevitable. It's not something that like we have control over. Like we're sitting here at the bottom of this wheel here. I wish I made better slides. At the bottom of this wheel here, we're not going to be able to ideologically like change the economic system. It's going to happen to us because we're developing technology such that it's going to create incompatibilities with our previous property owning regime. And that's like the argument in brief, and I'm going to go through each stage of it pretty soon here. But is there more questions or counters?
Well,
No, that's really helpful. That's super helpful.
Yeah, that'll help, because then you're not stuck blaming him for like designing a system he never really designed.
Yeah, no,
He's like anticipating the future.
Yeah, no, that I mean, I still have like some, I guess, some like responses to that, but that's helpful for sure. That's for sure helpful.
Real quick before about the wheel, does it go down? Does it cycle, or does it?
Yes.
Is it okay?
It's not temporally really. I'm kind of saying it's moving temporally. It doesn't move in time really, but the idea here is that like the things on the bottom change, and then afterwards the things on the top change, and then they only come by to sort of reinforce the stuff that's already happened down here.
It's more like a cause and effect rather than like over time.
Yeah. Okay. And so that on the sides here, it says like the bottom shapes and maintains the top, like it shapes it. It's like at the very formation of our philosophy is the economics of our society that's like telling our philosophy what to do, kind of. But the top maintains and shapes, you know. It's more of a sort of like maintenance of the economics that like our institutions do for us. Our politics is like maintaining the economic regime. That's a Marxist like way of viewing the relationship between like society and economics. Yeah. So anyway, I could read this again. Basically, I just wanted to tell you guys that Marx is a cheerleader for capitalism. He really is. He's not somebody that just like spends his entire time talking about how much of a mistake capitalism was. He's like, he views history as much more detached than that. History happens. It happens almost naturally. It sort of develops along lines that nobody's in charge of. And it's actually a wonder that capitalism can spring up entire, populations out of the ground, subjugation of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, etc. He's like, these things have happened because of capitalism. And that's wonderful. Perhaps we should like harness them towards a different end. But what we really get to,
makes sense.
What we really get to is this sort of strange, I think, interplay between what I call evolutionary Marx versus the revolutionary Marx that we're all, I guess, somewhat familiar with. Like the story of Marx is that he calls for revolution, right? It's bloody, it's violent. He wants to, kill all property owners, whatever, right? But before he does that, and before maybe he never does that, we'll find out. But before he does that, he talks about something quite different as far as like the transition from one economic system to another. What he talks about is, if we have to remind ourselves of that wheel I showed us, how there's a distinction between the sort of property relations, like how we sort of set up society to like manage the economics, and then the actual like productive forces, like how good we are at making a computer bit do something, or storing information, or producing a cloth, right? We get better at producing cloth over time, right? And perhaps there's an incompatibility with the way that we thought about like the property relation based on how good we are doing the production. And so this is what he has to say about that. He says, he's talking about feudalism and how feudalism changed to capitalism. He says, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of sorry, actually, I should read the whole thing. This is what I'll say. We see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. And into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. So the productive forces, right? Like instead of the feudal lord being in charge of everybody's land, and everybody working on that land had to go pay the feudal lord a bunch of money every winter or whatever. Not money, right? They went to go like give them grain or whatever, right? One person on that land became in like industriousness. They had like more industriousness than others, and so they would like collect the grain and take it to the market, right? Or they would take it into the town and sell it to the other guy from the county across the way who's making apples, and like and things would develop along those lines. Instead of this sort of feudal organization, you ended up with manufacturing, you ended up with mercantilism, you ended up with people like making money, right? And so pretty soon you ended up with somebody who had more money than the lord, and yet they had to sort of still abide by these old feudal arrangements, which prevented this person from making more money, prevented them from making more grain and apples, and prevented the peasants from enjoying the productive capacities of this new world that they lived in. Feudalism was holding back capitalism, right? The sort of feudal relations of property were holding back, were acting as fetters against the productive forces of capitalism that were happening underneath it. They had to be burst asunder. The relations of property had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder, right? We had the end of feudalism, right? Kings and queens were put on the chopping block. We developed constitutions to sort of ensure that we could do capitalism and liberalism and things like that in these new countries. And this is the development of feudalism to capitalism. Some folks just sort of started collecting more, producing more, had access to better technology, and so they were able to sell more, and it became incompatible with the existing relations of property. What about this story doesn't make sense yet? Because this is a very like, I love this part. This is like a really foundational part of Marx. This is how history happens for Marx. We're all good? Yeah. Elsewhere, Marx says the very same thing. He says, at a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. So we were able to sort of create these new technologies under the old regime, but pretty soon it just stops making sense. Why can't I make more? Like my machine is able to make more than I'm able to actually like sell, right? Or something like that, right? I would have access to more productive capacities, but I'm being held back by the property relations of the regime I'm living under. And so Marx says that the engine of history, the economics, right, is the engine of history. They will eventually burst asunder the property relations. And so why is this interesting for Marx? I said this and then I think we ended. Why is the story of capitalism, or from feudalism to capitalism, interesting as far as like why this happens or how this happens? It's interesting for him for a reason. Rory, you said it last time. Do you remember what you said? Well, this story is interesting because the same thing can happen, right? The same thing happened from capitalism to something else. He says a similar movement is going on before our eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. What else? For many a decade past, the history of industry and of commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put on its trial each time more threateningly the existence of the entire bourgeois society. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. So he's talking about these like cyclical natures of the capitalist economy where there's always a downturn, right? There's always a sort of sell off. There's always a sort of like clawback. What's the term in the stock market? We call it, it's something like pretty like, it always sounds really defanged to me when there's like all the anticipated like correction, right? It's a correction. These are people's lives we're talking about, right? I think that's like interesting. So anyway, but in these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity. The epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, has cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of the bourgeois property. So he's not saying like there's too much, turn it off. He's saying like, look, our economic system is producing so much stuff that we don't know what to do with. And then when that happens, it makes life worse for everybody. It drives prices down. Everybody's like worse off because we end up having to do all these like finagling things into the market to make it like make sense why we have too much stuff and the prices are too low. And he's like, why don't we use like this is an absurdity. Why don't we like use how awesome we are at producing stuff, right? Why are we over here like messing with it with our property relations that like makes it? And so in my mind, what is sort of like in plain words, right? This sort of like the incentive structure for profit, or perhaps, or the need for profit above all, is holding back how productive capitalism actually could be. Because of our property relations, we're actually being held back. And so there's like numerous examples of this, and I'm wondering if you guys have any. Like, what are some of the absurdity, like the absurd things that sort of like we've all maybe sort of like come to accept about our economic realities, but sort of reveal that like we're trying too hard maybe to like keep things the way they should, with the way that we think they should be, but in fact maybe they should move past this. I have a couple examples. I wonder if like I'm going anywhere anybody can pick up though.
Who's ready to pair?
I'm like stuck trying to think of an example. There's like so many, and I'm weirdly listening to this lecture on Marx on a 30th floor balcony. You know what I mean? Like, which is very apropos. But there's like so many instances like in life general where it's like I'm just like, dude, do I need this? Do I really need this thing? You know what I mean? Or like, do I really
got
have
one.
to have this fucking shit?
The do you know about the ET games that were dumped in the desert?
Yes,
In
this is
Mexico?
exactly right. Right. Yeah.
Like literally it becomes like there's such a problem not only with the production of the game, but then it costs them more to dump it than to like get it dumped properly than it would be to just literally leave it in the desert. Like,
Oh yeah,
that
they
is
do this
crazy.
with cars. They do this
Yeah.
with cars that they
Yeah.
don't sell, that they take the chips out and they park them in a lot in like Africa or something. So to not bring down demand for
This
next
is
year's
right.
cars in order to keep prices correct. So there's
This
literally
is like
lots of like
letting the
car
food
graveyards.
spoil rather than like give it away for free is sort of like the basic logic here that Marx is sort of looking at, I think. The sort of like we just can't like give the games to
China
like,
buying our trash.
yeah, something, I mean, so
I think that's
Derek's
kinda makes
example of like the video games that like perhaps could have had a better use by just giving them to like kids or whatever, right? But like you can't do that because you can't devalue the product to the point to where like, you know, that's dangerous to do that. So we have to just like dispose of them, right?
well, doesn't the goal not become the goal? The goal becomes make profit. So it doesn't matter if you're actually doing good in the world as long as you can profit. Right.
Yes.
Like that's the idea, like that it's short-sighted, or like how every year of my entire life there's been record-breaking heat and we know that there's an issue, but we won't do like, you couldn't like stop cruise ships from going because that would like, because rich people like to do that. And it's even though like nobody in their life needs to go on a cruise ship, but like we will destroy the planet because of it. Right.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure.
And what he has in mind here is that these things will become more and more like obvious to us. This is at least part of the argument here, is that like, look, these things are like so obviously going to like cause just like blatant contradiction. Like people are not going to be able to hold these things in their mind for long. And look, capitalism is so productive and so powerful and so creative, and like it's just gonna eat itself alive like quickly. That's what the argument of the manifesto is. He says the weapons which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie himself. He says that they become their own grave diggers. Not because they're sort of evil or whatever. He doesn't do that moralizing. What he does is he says like, this is logical. It's a simple like math equation. Like we have a system which is producing more than we know what to do with, and we're like hurting ourselves to make sure that we can keep it going rather than like, you know, orient it towards more productive ways, right? We would rather limit our own production seemingly than create a new system of property ownership that like more accurately like is aligned with how productive our capacities are. And he thinks that this will become so much of a contradiction that we will do something about it. And that's where we get into the revolutionary Marx. But again, I wanted to ask, is there any more discussion about that topic, that's sort of like evolutionary, like how capitalism evolves? Like what's holding it back is our silly property relations. He's not talking shit about capitalism itself. He's talking shit about how we haven't harnessed it correctly. That's really what the argument is. Sorry, Jeff.
Oh, again, I'm like comparing this property issue to feudalism, and it's like, is he saying that it's a really similar issue with property in feudalism?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank God. Okay, you couldn't hear me before. Sorry. I had all sorts of
Okay, I just muted him. Jeff, do you want to continue?
is it, I guess what I don't understand is he saying the same thing happened with feudalism where property turned in on itself, or is he creating a different issue for capitalism?
No,
Like,
it's
is
the
he
same exact thing that like
okay?
capitalism came up within feudalism.
Yes.
Well,
And
because of class struggle, right?
what can you tell me more about that?
Well, doesn't everything Marx believes that like all modes of any change in history is based on class struggle. So it's not it's just that like things got too intense and kind of like you see with capitalism at various parts is it only changes because of like we have the 40-hour work week because of class struggle. We have like writers striking right now because of class struggle. So at one point serfs were like, dude, this is major bullshit and we know it and we should kill these people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that like part of what of the story that he's saying here is like it doesn't really come down to like anyone's individual like designs, you know, or anyone's like ideas or whatever. It's just like it becomes like obvious that like, oh, like there's all this stuff out there for the taking, you know. Like the serfs were looking at their lords not doing any work, but they were also looking at their homie down the street who grew up with them but is now making a ton of money in the city, being a merchant, you know. And then they say, oh, why am I paying tithe to my lord? I should go work for my homie who's like has a factory, you know, and he'll pay me more, you know, I'll be able to make money myself. And like that's, you know, it's less like of a violent trajectory, I think, that like Marx is at least portraying here. You know, it's like
Can we
one that
circle back?
happens evolutionarily. Yeah, Howard.
You said something when my microphone wasn't working, but you said something to the effect of like we're unwilling to be as productive as we could be because we're
Yeah,
unwilling to like make changes to our property ownership. I'm
yeah,
paraphrasing.
yeah, yeah.
But I feel like that's not fair to the whole picture, right? Where it's like, okay, let's say that that's true, right? Let's say that a new system, maybe not this one, but maybe some system that's informed by the concepts that this idea is bringing to the surface would be more productive and would create more fuel for innovation that leads to net, you know, quality of life improvements globally, or whatever our end goal is.
Yeah.
So let's assume that both of those things are true, which I actually, yeah, which they may be. I think the piece you're missing is that there are clear consequences to a large number of people by making those changes that are very, very negative. And
we're going to talk about that.
I don't think it's that we're okay.
What I thought you were going to say,
it's a gross. Okay, sorry. What?
I thought you were going to say something which is interesting to me, which is like, well, maybe a part of what is productive about capitalism requires that property, that sort of antiquated property ownership.
So that comes later for me, right? That comes later for me in the sense of like, which I think you've probably heard this one, like you're tired of it, right? But it's like, why are people going to be motivated to participate in this system? And like if we have global, you know, gay state communism, then like no one's going to want to work. They're just going to want to sit around and like eat grapes naked in the sunshine, you know what I mean? But like that's a whole different thing. This is more like, okay, cool, like I can consider that sounds, yeah, there's some interesting stuff here for sure, but like
there's losers. The story that you're telling, Brian, is there's losers in this like this transition.
Well, and
right?
now even take it a step further, right? Selfishly, it's like, wait, so you're telling me that like all of these things that I've like bled to achieve and acquire, those are no longer mine? Why? Right. And they're being taken from me by
Howard, there's a difference between personal property and private property. If I own an apartment that I don't live in and I just profit off it, that's private property.
Howard actually does own private property.
Yeah, I own
And
I
then-
own both of those. I own both of those things.
Well,
I own
this
both
is
of those
also
things, and I
there are ways that are a middle ground if you're looking for actual practicality. Like the landlording realm is full of price fixing. It's full of like, you know, raising prices when there's really no reason to. If you establish something like housing co-ops where a group of people who lived in the building
Totally.
owned the building, it would make it so landlords would have to compete with an actual market price versus compete with each other in a way where they're not actually competing, but like, oh, I'm going to sell my 2-bedroom for this much. But like have ways
Got
that are like
it.
more like housing co-ops are super dank, and you can still have landlords, but they just have to like give more of a shit, which is
Got it.
dope.
Got it. Okay, cool. No,
It-
that makes sense.
yeah.
Do you own a rental property and pay interest on it?
I do not.
Okay, got it. So the problem with that like lib narrative of like these bloodthirsty landlords that are raking these poor innocent people over the coals is it completely ignores like the fiscal realities that go along with like owning a property and paying the mortgage on that property and dealing with the expenses that come with it. And I hate to break it to you, bud, but a housing co-op ain't the solution. And I'm not saying I know what the solution is, and I'm not negating the very real, like that I think there's some interesting ideas being discussed here. But the problem is that like these hyper idealized oversimplifications of real life neglect to address the very real fact that it's like, dang, like somebody just dumped their entire life savings after years of working hard and saving to get ahead to try to give their family a leg up. And because a way that they're doing that is considered private property, they should be penalized for it in order to make like some amorphous entity called the fucking proletariat have easier lives. And by no means am I not open to coming up with, again, like I think this is we're moving beyond the scope of like what you were talking about, Brian, but by no means am I not open to coming up with ways to evolve capitalism, as you call it, evolve beyond capitalism, as you call it. But the only way you sell me on that, is if you present a way doing it where I don't get fucked and where other people don't get fucked.
Housing co-ops are not an idealistic idea. They work in many cities and countries around the world. And all I'm saying is like economically, what they make happen is so that the profit hungry landlords, which there are, that's not that there's a reason people, like you're saying, like you want to get in just to get a leg up for your family. And that's, you know, I can respect that. I can understand that. But it's still like something that requires work. And I think that it can easily be taken advantage of. Co-ops just make sure that there is not a gouging of prices and overall make the system better for everybody. And in like Vienna, in Vancouver, there's lots of examples of housing co-ops like helping the overall housing market as well as lessening homelessness and different things like that. As far as just a practical, pragmatic, like it seems like that's where your head is based most of the time.
Yeah, 100%. To me, this just really comes down to like how does any of this like work in real life? And I just again, I mean, I'm sure there's bloodthirsty landlords out there, but like my tenant pay like I subsidize my tenant, like my tenant doesn't even come close to covering their half of my mortgage. Like it's just fucking crazy to me when I hear people talk about like these landlords that are raking people's over the coals, because I don't know any of them. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't. All the landlords I know are like, you know, maybe they're making a couple $100 and they're getting some of their mortgage covered.
I personally know many landlords who make a fucking ridiculous amount of money on rent.
You know
Oh,
a lot of much
you
know a lot of much wealthier people than I do, and that's very, very possible.
I'm just saying in real life though, like they make a lot more money than I do on rent,
sure,
on slumlording, you know.
Totally possible. I don't personally know
I have a couple like sort of canned responses. I really love the landlord co-op or the, you know, the property co-op thing. I think that's a really good example of like the sort of like a new type of property relation that actually gets us closer to, you know, uh, better
Basically
or
fake
better
communism.
organizing and divvying up but so as far as like some of the canned responses, like one of them is like, okay, so if you're having that much trouble making a profit, like, look, the state will help you, we'll just take it off your hands. And don't worry about it anymore, Howard. It's fine. But it to not joke about it, there is something called, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution is something like the state has, can with adequate, reconciliation, or provided we provide you with enough compensation, we can claim your property. And like, using that is like kind of what I think what they have in mind in the first instance, while there still exists a state to do things like this. That's how like a sort of democratic, move towards
again, hold on.
socialism would
That's
exist. It would be a sort
that
of like, we would give you fair market value for your property, which we are no longer allowing anybody to own, things like that anymore. But
wait,
here's
but again, taking my personal side of it out of the equation now, how does that answer for, and I don't want us to get stuck on here because I think you're talking about a lot of really interesting stuff, but I'm like, how does that answer for people that are like, no, like, I don't want fair compensation.
the
Like, this
same
is
way
my
it works
family.
now, which is like, okay, well, we're gonna bulldoze your shit,
Got it.
it's
Okay.
just, you just use massive state power for these things, and like, we just sorry, like,
So
we
this
made
is
a we
starting to
made a
sound,
mistake letting you do this in the first place, and we're just correcting that mistake
so
now.
now, so again, and like, this is where, and that's what, but no, that's great. I'm glad you said that though, because that's where, like, for me, it starts to become this divergence of like, oh wow, these are some really interesting ideas. Like, maybe there's something to this. So like, oh, okay, cool. So like, it's another fuck dictatorship, like every instance of trying to implement like these sorts of governmental structures. And so like, okay, no thanks.
Well,
You know what I mean?
stick with us for a little bit longer.
Okay, cool.
Marx thinks he's going to address you, and so he says it
Okay,
like
cool.
this. And so he moved, and so this is like kind of closer to what we think when we sort of like, when you're not studying Marx, you might hear of him as like a revolutionary or something like that. And so like, this is like close to like what he has in mind, or to what we might think of as that. And he says the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. And I always think this is a really interesting phrase, to win the battle of democracy. There's like plenty of socialists who have totally completely given up democracy. They don't vote, they don't like care about electoral politics whatsoever. It's all bourgeois, like, nonsense. It's not, and Marx is telling them to like win the battle of democracy, like go out there and like gain power through whatever means you can, including that sort of boring, dumbass November, early November elections. Win the battle of democracy, it'll be easier for you, as Marx is saying, right? And so I think included in here is something like, Howard, we would make overtures to you, we would sort of like, we would attempt to like win you to this side. We would show you.
Can you hear me? Did
Yeah,
my
we can.
microphone break? Okay, cool. I mean, yeah, and dude, like, maybe I want to be clear because I feel like I was being like super black and white a second ago. Like, maybe there's a way that could be done. I just know that and I'm trying to like leave out the hyper wealthy generational wealth, like 17 generation Rockefeller type folks. But I know that for like normal folks that have been struggling to pull their families like into the upper middle class, and that's like the dream that they've been working for decades, that it's a tall order to, and because yeah, sure, kill the upper class, right? Like kill the billionaires, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm not even like bringing that. I don't agree with that, but I'm not even bringing that into this discussion. I'm more like all the families that have like, they've struggled to be able to like make it so that their kids don't have to worry about college being paid for. And so that when they die, there's like a family home to leave to their children. And you've got to like create incentives that are strong there, not just to compensate on an equal monetary value, but to compensate for like the years of lifestyle. Because again, I'll tell you, I do hear this a lot in my friend groups when we talk about like college debt relief and things like that. You get this uproar from people who are like, wait a second, like I worked
Fairness, right? It's like a
two
fairness.
yeah, I worked 2 jobs putting myself through college, so I would only have to take out $20,000 of student loans, and I paid that off in my first year by like living in a cheap apartment. And then I've got these fucking liberal arts majors that took out $120,000 loans, and they work at CVS. Like, why should their debt be forgiven when I put in blood, sweat, and tears so that I wouldn't put myself in that situation?
Smarter,
And
not
you can,
harder,
and like,
baby.
and the libs, you libs can like laugh about that, but if you're actually trying to make this like a real like tenable thing, that's like a valid thing that has to be addressed. And
It's a good point.
so, yeah,
It is a good point. I just want to just say for just a real quick second here, you mentioned that you personally are subsidizing half of your tenants'
more than that,
mortgage, right?
yeah.
But one thing to keep in mind is like the person you're really mad at here, dude, is not the government, it's the bank. It's the bigger version of what you're capitalizing off of now. They're the ones who are going to come take your home, dude. Not the government. And then on top of that, half
Well,
of your
no,
mortgage,
hold on.
half of your mortgage
Is interest?
goes,
Yeah.
yes, is interest.
Well,
Where does the
that's all
other half
bullshit,
go?
though.
Where does the
Hold
half
on,
that you
because
are not subsidizing
if you
go,
want to
though?
play that game, I call bullshit, because the reason our interest rates are so high are because of leftist fucking quantitative easing that happened, where the government printed trillions of dollars, which of course fucking created
No,
rapid
I'm not talking
rampant
about that.
inflation.
I'm not talking about the
But you are
rapid
talking
inflation.
about that.
No.
Oh,
I'm
But you are
about-
talking about that because you're
No.
talking about the interest rate.
Was
which is
that a
what's
mistake,
crippling-
Howard? It was a mistake to do all that stuff.
What I'm talking
Dude, but
about is the half.
Amortization, baby. 70% of your mortgage is being paid to interest, regardless of the interest rate. It could be 1%, 3%,
That's
or
what I'm talking about.
9%.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's
That's
called
exactly
amortization. You can look at the table on your mortgage packet, Howard.
Yeah,
It's on
yeah,
page
I know.
fucking 42. So for a long period of time, fucking you're paying 70% just to interest. You're not even
know.
That's
making
what
payments
I'm
on
trying
it.
to
So
say.
Trust
the
me, I'm
actual
very
interest
fucking
rate
aware.
is
very
way
fucking aware
fucking
of
red
that
herring,
table.
dude.
Yeah. But hold on though. You're wrong too, which surprises me because you know this shit better than I do. And here's why. The property value, the real rent that I collect on my second unit, the real number has not changed by more than a couple $100 in the last 5 years. And yet the actual dollar for dollar, regardless of the percentage of interest being paid, as recently as 3 years ago, it was extremely profitable, right? But because of the interest rate going up, it's no longer profitable. So my point is just that, like, that's to try to blame it all on like, oh no, that's just the way it works, and 70% and it's going to get amortized, blah, blah, blah. It's bullshit, because the rent being collected there is still the same.
Yeah. But
There's a delta there.
None of that is
There
the
is
point
a
that I'm trying
delta
to
there
make.
that
The
was
point that I'm
created.
trying to make, though, Howard, is that the half of the money that you are subsidizing for your tenant, whether you're subsidizing that half or not, is going into an asset that you can then sell at a later time. So like you're
Yeah, sure. For sure.
So that's what I'm trying to say, is like, regardless of the financial realities of the interest and the amortization table and all of that shit, the inherent unfairness of it is that you are not laboring for that other half that you are now subsidizing.
But that's not fucking true. I
Why?
labored my ass off to be able to buy that. What are you talking
I
about?
just don't agree with that. I don't think that you did, dude.
Dude, you're fucking nuts, bro.
So,
I just don't think
you're
that you did.
fucking
I
out
don't
of
know.
your
I don't
mind.
think that you
Next
did
week,
anything special.
I want to read
Dude,
some
you're
selections from
fucking
Capital.
crazy.
Next week, I want to read some selections from
And
Capital,
that's why
which will
libs
actually
are so,
like
dude, I can't. I
it'll
just,
lay
Dude,
bare
I
some
own
of this.
property too. I get it. I understand what you're saying. It's not like I'm over here, coming from a position that is not the same as yours.
Let's set this aside. Marx himself, at this point in his life, knows that he hasn't answered all questions. He will attempt to do so in Capital, which we'll read next week, where we will discuss things like primitive accumulation, where profit comes from, where value comes from. It'll be fun. I think you guys will all have See, these are all really like basic fundamental questions.
These are the
Are they
heart of the issue.
philosophical? This is like
This is
important
the
stuff.
heart of the artichoke, dude.
We got it. We got to figure this stuff out. You know,
You
there
gotta
seems to be a
declaw the
disagreement about it.
artichoke heart, dude.
So anyway, Marx says that we're going to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, which is scary. But then he also says, i.e. in the proletariat organized as a ruling class, right? It's almost as if he knows, if he says, we're going to organize it all in the hands of the state, you guys are going to get all up in arms and spooked. But he's like, look, the state is you guys. That's what I have in mind. I have in mind, like, we're going to do it together, you know? And he'll say more about that in a second here. But so again, let's figure out, like, what does he have to say about the actual thing? What does communism look like? Again, he's really cagey about this. He doesn't want to be make recipes for the cook shops of the future, but he does tell us, at least in brief, what he has in mind, like where he wants it to go. And he says the immediate aim of the communists is the formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of the political power by the proletariat. Class in itself and for itself, right? So right now, the proletariat is a class in itself. They are unaware of themselves as members of this class, but once they become a class for themselves, they understand themselves to be a member of the proletariat. They understand themselves to not own any property, but also do all the work. They will become a class for themselves, and then this revolution can take place. And he says the theory of the communists, what's fundamental to all this, may be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. And so again, this is where a part of the lecture where you talk about the distinction between personal property and ownership of the means of production.
I think this is where he loses half of his audience, is like in that sentence right there.
Well, right, because
that's what I would predict. Like,
because
people
at
are
the
like,
time,
yeah, this is great ideologically, and then right there, people are like, oh,
well, at the
never
time
mind,
we
dude.
hadn't sanctified property as like a fundamental right of human beings. You know, that was still a brand new idea. That like property is right there with life and liberty, you know, that was a brand new idea. And Marx probably didn't feel like he needed to like spend as much time as we now do discussing the merits of private property.
Because it didn't exist in the same way.
Because it didn't exist for anybody in the Zoom room of Marx's. Nobody owned property. Nobody owned property.
Well, the companies did.
Yeah, like the 5 people in like the very power centers of the city, you know? It was very clear to everyone who was profiting and who was working. Things have developed now, you know, like we have other things to talk about as far as like maybe property's benefiting more people than we originally thought. But like, well, it was pretty clear at the time that like there are people who own stuff and there are people who work. That was very clear at the time, you know, and it was the people who own stuff, the ones who own private property, that were holding back how, you know, how good of a life everybody could live, and like preventing people from like living above starvation, right? That was basically the idea. And so again, what does he have in mind? And he says this, he says communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. He's not after like ensuring people live below a certain line. It's not the point. All it does is it deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of appropriation. That's what private property for Marx is. It's the power to subjugate the labor of others. That's what he has in mind as far as abolishing that system. We're going to make sure you can't just like own other people's labor. If they want to labor creatively because it's a part of themselves, a part of their soul, they want to do that. We want to make sure that happens. If we can remind ourselves of weeks past when we talked about the economic and philosophical manuscripts, you know, like foundational to all of this is that we live now in a system where nobody's able to be like their true selves. They're not able to labor creatively and productively. If they're laboring productively, it's not creative because it's like based on someone else's designs and for someone else's profit. If they're laboring creatively, they're not making any profit. That's the system of labor that we live under, and it's an abomination. Marx.
That
Oh.
maybe it's just his vocabulary, but that just doesn't seem true to me at all. I feel like the people who are the most creative, uh,
Are making a lot of money.
yeah, dude. The people
Well,
who
yeah,
see the
may-
system as
perhaps
it
I'm
is and then
doing-
are able to create, I'm not talking about art. I'm talking about like,
I think that they're the ones that are making all the money. Perhaps
business
they've
ideas.
created a system,
creatively owning more.
but it's somebody
private
else
property,
doing
you
the
know?
labor.
Yeah,
The
okay.
argument would be that there's
Oh,
somebody
okay,
else
got it.
doing the
Alright.
labor, you know?
Yeah, okay, got it.
Is
And so, yeah.
is the end, I guess, is the end changing for Marx there? It's like, is he now trying to define the more individualistic end or goal by talking
Oh,
about, I guess that's what I'm just confused.
we're kind of
on. It's
moving
like, is
away
the-
from this sort of science-y way of discussing society and how it changes. And now we're moving towards like,
Yeah, what's
like
the end? Or now it's more
fulfilling-
individual. Yeah, some
fulfilling
individual
someone's
destiny
like
or some shit.
individual. Yeah. And so that's always like this sort of strange contradiction in Marx. I think you missed a week where we talked about, where we read a book of his that he wrote when he was really young, when he was like in his early 20s. And he's very much a humanist, and he's talking about how labor is the human activity, and we need to make sure that we labor creatively, and that's what makes us human beings, and that's why capitalism is an abomination, because it prevents us from doing that and stuff like that. And so I at least am suggesting to you that it's cropping back up here. Whereas he wants to, now he's an older man and he wants to be the scientific X to Y, he wants to draw like clear lines in history without having the individual subjective experience muck things up. But still, nevertheless, it gets up in there. He still nevertheless has this moralizing, spurts of emotion, right? That's how I would describe that. I'm not sure if that is satisfactory to you.
It's almost satisfactory. We don't mind me
Okay.
asking a follow-up question.
We're all imperfect, we all people have tried really hard to make the narrative of into any intellectual's life, and like draw clear, like this is this era, then he's moving into this era or whatever. And it's never that clear. It's never easy, sometimes things are messy. But then so it gets even more, granular. He's, he has a 10-point program. The first is the abolition of property.
A 10-point
abolition of property
Oh,
land,
fuck,
applications
dude.
of all
The
rents of land to public purposes. Well, how much of this is revolutionary? This is my question to you: is how much of this is actually completely out of left field? He's just gotten done telling us how our relations of property are preventing us from living good lives. It's preventing capitalism from being as good as it could be.
Okay.
So he's saying we're going to get rid of the property thing. We're going to still let the factories churn. It's not like we're going to go bulldoze all the productive stuff. We're just going to make sure that nobody can profit off of somebody else's labor. They're still going to work. They're just going to work towards better ends than some idiots,
I don't know why that feels bad.
And he says a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. I don't think that's really controversial. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. Sometimes people have a hard time with that. Sometimes some people think that's a real problem. That
one's so sick, dude.
I think that one's my number one favorite one of all of them. I agree with that
Makes
so much.
real competition.
Yeah. Also, giving your children money make them weak.
Where does it go then? To the
hard
state?
times.
Yeah, swag men create dope times.
It goes to the state, and we'll talk about what the state will look like in the next slide.
Cool. You guys can opt into that if you want. Just don't.
Well, dude, I mean the dopest
Right.
the dopest captains of industry did do that. Like every library is named after one of them. Just look around.
Because they gave it to the library instead of.
Well,
a
not
kid
all
or
of it,
something.
but like that one railroad guy can never Carnegie.
Carnegie.
He like gave all his money away, and now like everything in America is named after him because he was like the last guy who did it.
Because that's at a certain point, there's nothing you can spend that much money on. You have
Well,
to
that's
like
the only, yeah, that's the only other way to gain prestige after you're like, that's like the end game, you know, you gotta be like Bezos and just like threaten to give it away the rest of your life, you know?
So he says confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. I'm not quite sure what this means. I don't know what an immigrant and rebel is or what he has in mind. It's probably something like, you know, you have to, you know,
Some crazy shit.
a centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly.
Oh my God.
What's wrong with that? We should have that, right?
We already have that. That's already,
Centralization
Sorry.
of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state.
okay. That
Yeah,
one's
so
fine.
no more
That's true.
logistics company, no more private
Yeah.
hotshot company.
No, I mean, that's horrendous. That's insane.
Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state to the bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. We're going to do a Green New Deal, except it's going to have
This-
factories too.
He's talking about the soil?
Yeah, like because he wanted to make more farmland. You know, we had the state of the soil. You know, was of vital importance to the statecraft folks. You know, nowadays we just let the private companies do all that. You know, equal liability of all to work. Really? Establishment of industrial armies, especially for
What,
agriculture.
you thought we would be upset with that one?
Well, I don't know. To me, it's always like, well, what about
That's the
people who
one?
can't work? There's like more than half of society can't work. Why
Okay.
are
I
we
just want to
always
eat
so
grapes.
why are we always so upset about people who can't work? Most of us can't work. Children, old people, people who have disabilities.
Who's
Like,
upset about people not being able to work? That's my
I
question.
don't know. I just feel like that's a very common underpinning of like an
I think you're
Dude,
confused. I think people are saying.
Yeah, my mom pisses me the fuck off. I gotta be straight.
I think people are saying it's annoying when people who don't work as good get the same amount of money. That's what I think they're saying. Not that they can't work, you know. Oh, you mean paying for people who won't work? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think what I think
Oh,
is
yeah.
is like
I won't and can't are so fucking different. Won't is
Most
like you
people-
should be killed.
Most people want to work.
Can't is, yeah, but what about
that's
the
a part
people
of
who
Marx's bargain. A part of Marx's bargain here, or you know, a gamble is actually probably a better word, is that we will find joy in our work once again, you know, and we won't voluntarily, you know, remove ourselves from the workforce. But in case there exists, you know,
fine. I mean, I'm down with that.
in case, you know, somebody is being a malcontent, he's saying that there's going to be an equal liability of all to work, you know, and
Yeah, I
an
hate that.
establishment of industrial armies to make sure that we go door to door to make sure people work. I don't know. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. We're going to get rid of this like silly, you know, middlemen in between, you know, the supply chains. We're going to link them, right? We're not going to like let the market unsatisfactorily, you know, link themselves. We're gonna centralize. There's gonna be a grand plan for
Real quick.
for the production. Yeah.
For number 8, is his contingency on his gamble that like, oh, I'm gonna gamble that people find joy in their work, but in case they don't, we'll set up an army to force them to.
That's what I heard too.
I think
Yeah.
that's exactly
That's fucked up.
that's what I said to you. That's what I said.
That doesn't seem like
I was
a what did you call it? A bargain. That's like, hey, if you don't do this, that's fine. That's like a non-choice. What is it?
What a
Yeah.
fucking contingency plan! Like, they'll find joy in their work again. Is my ideal. But if they
Well,
don't,
look,
we'll
again,
force them to.
the
Especially
gamble
for the farms.
the gamble is that we will literally like
Kill
this
you.
is our state. This is our like this is our designs that we're making real into the world. We are making the, you know, the United States of the socialist workers or whatever, you know, and we will want to be a part of this. This is like our stuff, you know, and like we're gonna want to go do it. That's like a part of the as I say, the bargain here.
I
Yeah,
can
no,
just
I
see
got
how
you.
this is so easily read wrong.
Yeah, totally.
You
I
know,
mean, he
and
uses really
feels a
inflammatory
dictatorship.
language, you know, like
It's not great. I don't like to have people read the Communist Manifesto if they're like trying to find out what Marx is all about, you know. I like to start with other stuff and finish with other stuff, but you know, it's important to read it. 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of
Boo.
children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production.
what's
We're
the one
gonna
you
get
said?
rid of, we
Boo.
are gonna get rid of the humanities education pretty clearly, right? Like we're not gonna do liberal arts stuff.
What do you mean?
Combination of education with industrial production, et cetera, et cetera. Like he knows, he like,
Wow,
you guys know what
it's
I'm talking
the
about.
the first logical thing I've heard in the last 20 minutes.
Which is what I'm sorry, I missed it.
Combination of education with industrial production. We're gonna, like, the education is going to be tuned towards creating
Trade
productive
school.
members of society, you know. Trade school, yeah, sure.
That's whack.
I agree. I don't like that one either.
What the
whack.
fuck? Why?
So there's more here. And
how
it's
could
less.
how could you argue with that one? Wait, hold on.
I
I'm
have a
really
degree in
curious.
I have a degree in philosophy, dude. I have no grasp of stand.
But like, that's what he's
It's
saying is
fucking-
like, he's fucking hates philosophers. I
He
feel
does.
like.
Fucking whack, dude. Fuck
I feel
Karl
like
Marx, dude.
I feel like he
It's true.
hates philosophers more than anybody else.
So he'll actually tell us about philosophers in a second here. But first he's going to tell us about this because we're worried about the state. You know, the state's going to collect all this power. You guys are talking about all the property is going to go into the hands of the state. You're going to centralize communication. All the logistics companies are going to be one state company. What are you talking about? He says, when in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Which is like, this is a Marxist phrase that you hear. You just hear it, like the public power will lose its political. That's like it's meant to be like a QED, you know, like when Howard is telling me about how bad, you know, the state centralization plan is going to be. I might have just said, well, the public power is going to lose its political character, and then go on, you know. Like that, it's meant to, that's literally what he meant. Like, and what he means by this, he says political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its conquest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as class. And then this is, you know, to use the famous phrase from Engels, this is how the state withers away. And instead, and I think Engels goes on to say, like, and instead of like I forgot it. The state will wither away, and we will now just be responsible for the administration of things rather than like something that's like, God, I wish I remembered the phrase. The state will lose its political character. It's the state will wither away is a part of the argument here, because the state as such only exists for the oppression of one class over the other, right? That's the argument. Why is he wrong? Why is he wrong about that?
I guess I maybe cover this later, but like, how does he? How did I don't understand how it ensures the state is good. You know, like, okay,
well, because it's made up by the right. So you're wondering. So like,
our
is
state
it in the hearts of even the
supposedly made up by the
proletariat?
people, dude.
That's what exactly right.
Like
like,
that's our whole thing in America is we're made up by the people for the, you know what I mean? That's the whole point.
Yeah. So
the whole
if
thing.
you went, so elsewhere, I think it even in the introduction to one of the prefaces of this, Engels or Marx maybe just says something like, you can't just simply take the bourgeoisie out and install the proletariat into the existing forms of, because they will become the bourgeoisie. You know, you have to like alter the foundation. You have to alter the base, the economic base, Because then guess what? The reasons why you get corrupt when you have power, the reason why you're worried about the proletariat becoming corrupt and being bad is because of our existence in this like antagonistically designed economic base of capitalism, which of course creates antagonisms and of course creates incentives for people to fuck each other over. But if we abolish all that stuff, we will no longer have the sort of design to fuck each other over or to make sure that we get more than our neighbor or whatever, right? That's what he would say.
I have, something just occurred to me, that this whole concept, like, is any of this, putting aside all of like the grotesque flaws of it, is any of this possible, like, unless it happened globally simultaneously?
That's
Like,
right.
could
Good
this-
job, Howard. So, okay. So this is going to be, I wonder if I should have an entire class about this, because this becomes the entire debate in Soviet Russia between Stalin and Lev Bronstein, right? Who ends up with an ice pick in his head for saying things like, Stalin, we have to like encourage the global revolution. We can't just do communism in one state. This does not work. And so Stalin tries very hard in order to make sure that idea doesn't get out, right? But yes, Marx
Got it.
himself, even at the time of writing this, is very much concerned with an international revolution. He says, workers of the world unite. It's not meant to happen in one country and stay in one country. It could sort of pop up in one country, but it needs to fairly quickly evolve into a worldwide revolution, because capital will take flight and find,
Yep.
So yeah, Leon Trotsky is Howard, you're a Trotskyist.
I don't know what that means.
It's really offensive.
Not as offensive as
Wow.
the disgusting shit that came out of your mouth tonight.
Oh, I'm sorry, dude. I'm really sorry. Jeez. I thought we were
What's a
just.
Trotskyist, Brian?
Well, I just told you, it's somebody who wants to ensure that the revolution happens globally. And to a Stalinist, it's like a counter-revolutionary, like blowhard who's getting in the way of class consciousness, So
Blowhard.
this is perhaps the most like I keep saying this over and over again, and you guys don't believe me with you every time I say it.
Well, it's
But
just
this
like
is probably the most famous Marxist phrase about what communism looks like. Well, what did you think I was going to say?
what?
Never.
Oh, I was just gonna. You said you keep saying this over and over, and we don't
Oh.
we don't believe you. And I was gonna say it. Well,
Oh
'cause
no.
keep
I
crying
don't
wolf.
care. I don't care if you believe me about that. I care about like
Oh.
just like my sort of like gloss on the impact of Marxism or whatever. I was saying like this phrase matters. This phrase, people
Oh.
talk about this one all the time, and like I'm aware that the circles that I associate are kind of strange. But anyway, so this is what Marx has to say. This is probably Engels speaking, and in fact, we know it's Engels speaking because Marx has a joke about it in the line notes when he's editing it. But this is what they have to say about what communism actually looks like. And they say, in communist society, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner. Philosophize is the other word for criticize. Do philosophy after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critic, philosopher. And so here is the sort of insight that we look at ourselves as being our jobs. And Marx is like communism has a different vision for that, right? We are workers in communism, but we are all of one. And we get to sort of pursue what our desires are. Yes, we might have to clean the toilets, but we will take turns doing so, as designed by the administration of things, right? Like there will be some sort of administration that will tell us when we need to clean the toilets, probably. But it will be made up of us as well. You know, we will have our turn doing that, but we will also have our turn
Well, if you
cleaning the
don't,
toilets.
the
But
army will come in and fucking make you. according to
yeah, and we will
number
be a part of
8.
that army tomorrow, you know, maybe. like we'll have our leave from that army one day.
But
as well.
but hold on. Do we also cycle in through the army? You know?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's like
Yeah,
we're
okay,
also
so
yeah.
theoretically, I could be killing my friend for not because they didn't want to clean the toilet.
Hopefully that
Oh.
never happens, you know. Hopefully
Well,
your
I'm just
friend
bringing
is.
up. I'm bringing up an
It's
idea
true.
here.
That's
Like
that's
you
very
could
true.
you
That's
could be put in
like
charge. You could be called upon.
Well, you
Yeah.
did this in the house with
to-
like MIC.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
one
that's what I'm
week you were
saying.
like
Uh-huh.
fucking
Yeah,
getting
exactly.
yelled at, and the next week you were yelling.
that's precisely right.
Wow.
And
so
so
the
we
house,
never
the house is
become-
communist,
The house is 100% communist. Couldn't be more communist.
socialist.
And so, you know, fishing in the afternoon, criticize and doing philosophy after dinner. Again, that's a really famous thing that people would say. Like I have been biting my tongue whenever you guys have a question. I just want to respond to in like the pithy Marxism phrase
I
all the
hate
time.
that.
But I swear to God, I do it like as a quarter of the time that I want to.
You say like, we'll take care of that for you. That one, I just don't like that one at all. Don't worry.
But so
we'll
this is
take
another
care of
one,
that.
and this is so to tell you the story about this one. So it's likely that Engels was writing this as a draft, and he wrote something like, I will do something today, another tomorrow. I will hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening. Just as I have a mind without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, or shepherd. He doesn't say philosophy, Engels does. But then what Marx does is in the liner notes, in the sort of like editing, he says like, yeah, and we'll do philosophy after dinner as a sort of joke. And like, if like the apparently, I don't understand it, but apparently the German of this is sort of funny. And what he's saying to Engels is like, let's get back on topic. Why are you talking about this like nonsense? We need to be talking about capitalism and like what's going to
Is
happen.
he
We don't
older
need to
than
worry.
Engels?
They're the same age.
Do you think they were lovers?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. Well, maybe. I mean,
I think they were, personally.
they didn't spend a whole lot of time together. A lot of it was like,
Yeah, that's what I
male.
would write too. If I,
But so once
what I mean?
again, this quote has been, you know, it got printed with Marx's comments, you know, with Marx's edit. And so we read it straight. We read it totally straight. Oh, we will philosophize after dinner. But it's quite likely that what Marx meant to do was to tell Engels to get back on topic, stop talking about, why are you talking about communism? We're critics of capitalism. And this isn't another work. This isn't in the Communist
Interesting.
Manifesto. He's saying like, wasting our time. You're creating space for people to disagree with you. Let's get back into the fun. Like that's what I interpret what his liner notes saying. Like, yeah, we'll do philosophy after dinner.
Wait, question. So what was he angling at then? I'm confused.
What was Engels?
Just like oh, nice.
Who?
I didn't even
Which
do that
one?
on purpose.
Which one?
Yeah, no. What was he getting at then? If he's like, no, we're just supposed to be critiquing capitalism. Was it because he wanted to improve capitalism, or I'm if it wasn't?
Well, a part of
to
my
create-
argument so far is like we can't do much about capitalism except recognize where it's leading us, where it's like preventing us from getting where we want to go, and that's our job.
I get that.
You
I
know?
get that. But no, my question is with his dispute with Marx being that no, don't talk about communism. We're just here to critique capitalism. But like,
Marx's
isn't
dispute with Engels. Engels is the one who's always more clear, and he's like, look, they're gonna want to know what communism looks like.
Oh, got it.
Let's tell them, you know, we're gonna be
So,
hunters in
okay,
the
then-
morning and fishermen, whatever, you know.
So then again, my question remains: what to Marx then, if not to create communism or something like it, or some next evolution, something to take the place of the dying beast that is late stage capitalism?
Yeah.
What is the objective then? That's what I'm
Marx is
confused
like
on.
he really wants to like let that be somebody else's job, I think. Somebody that comes up during the revolution. And there's gonna be lots of more
Got it.
like
Okay.
there's gonna be like what I think pretty convincing arguments for why that that has to be true, that you can only envision what comes next while you're in the formation of
No,
it.
that
Like, you
I actually
can't.
agree with that. No, I agree with that. That's a dial mover.
And
Not
so
on some of his terrible ideas, but that makes a lot of sense. That seems pretty wise, because obviously there's going to be, if this is like a completely novel system, it's going to have to be informed by people that
yeah,
are living inside of like this new construct.
yeah.
That makes
And
sense.
Marx
That
is
makes a lot
aware
of
of that,
sense.
but he like betrays himself, like he ends up, giving a 10-point program for communism, and like it's not great, like, and like it's sort of confusing. Like, well, what do you mean? So like you want us to not get bogged
Well,
down
dude,
in
that's
like
my
this stuff.
so like, putting aside my vitriol at some of the insanity spouted tonight, that's
Mhm.
my main issue with all of this, is like, what
I have one more main
cool.
issue for you.
Well, let me just say this really quick though. Is like,
Okay.
I feel like the collective, in order for this to work, like I'm stoked that like someone else thought that, right? It has to be global. It has to be global simultaneously, and in order for it to work, there has to be like a collective evolution of not just like the property or whatever, but of like human consciousness, right? Like, I don't
Yeah.
think that, and so if those two things don't happen simultaneously, I don't think this could work. And that's why I think communism is such a fundamentally flawed and broken idea, is because like it's not being created by it's like, what's the Albert Einstein quote? Like, the mind that created the problem can't solve the problem, or some shit.
Yeah.
Like, there needs to be a completely new global paradigm shift before a
You're not a
consciousness will
materialist.
exist, that can even fathom what this needs to be,
I don't
because
disagree
it ain't
with that.
communism.
You're not a materialist. Marx would say like this, you're not doing historical materialism then. You're talking about changing the zeitgeist or something in your
Yeah,
head.
yeah,
He
yes.
doesn't even want to bother arguing with you at that point. He's like, you misunderstood me when I was talking about materialism. And look, I'm not saying you're wrong, of course. Like, that's a totally legitimate disagreement, but it's it's on a level that Marx would be like, there's nothing to argue about. Like, we disagree about how history happens. We
Got it.
disagree
Okay.
about what changes.
Okay.
And so my
Okay.
last thing was just funny because I found this meme while I was looking for stuff, and like, and it's sort of like, I don't know, should get us to think about how Marxism is portrayed and what's funny about it. This distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of video games generally, but the abolition of white males in video games. But modern white male video game characters are the most final and complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating toxic masculinity that is based on racial and gender antagonisms, on the exploitation of the black transgender lesbians by the white male gamers. The theory of communism may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all white cishet male video game characters. And so the reason I have this here is because I believe this to be like an unironic meme for some people, like Marx does.
Wait,
Not that
really?
Marx says this, but like Marx, this is Marxism. Isn't this Marxism to some people? Like whenever you see some sort of like anti like
No,
Gamergate
that's like
stuff.
the conservative. That's like the conservative, like, nonsense. I mean, I didn't hear any of. Maybe I'm just too dumb to see it, but I didn't hear any of that in anything you talked about.
I think some people would draw a clear line from like ID poll, like wokeism,
Yeah.
to Marxism.
Well,
And
and I can
there is a line
see.
there,
Yeah,
but
yeah, I agree.
it's way more complicated and a much more interesting philosophical
And
dissent than I think people are prepared to, talk about.
hold. And this is from someone that abhors ID Paul stuff even more than Marxism. Can I see some correlation between those two? But I don't think it's I don't think they're, what's the opposite of mutually exclusive, Brian? Like, I don't think they're like attached at the hip, right? Like, I think it for sure makes sense to me why like the victim mentality, like blue hairs that want to blame everyone on the meme that caused all their problems, like, are attracted to Marxism. But I also don't think that I think that like that shit's all just a little horseshit. But Marxism, I think there's like, okay, this guy has some really interesting ideas that I think are worth talking about. That like if global consciousness could be I mean, again, I'm not like saying I agree with Marxism because we haven't even talked about some of the other points that you brought up, Brian, which I think need to be addressed here in terms of motivations and incentives and like all these other things that are very important. But I think it's possible to have like a legitimate, intelligent, practical conversation about some of these ideas, whereas like the wokeism stuff is just like garbage gobbledygook.
Well, perhaps in a different class, I would love to draw that line from Marxism to modern stuff like that, but it's beyond the scope of where I want to go. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Is there something we wanted to finish on or whatever? Any last thoughts or questions?
Jeff, what do you think about that? I'm really curious. What, as a
Well,
philosopher, like what's
I identify and emphasize with evolutionary Marx in the fact that, like, I've felt this at every job where I didn't own the place. You know what I mean? It's like I will always feel like I am not getting my proper cut or my proper share because I don't own the results of my labor. And as a result, I will always be mad in some capacity at my boss. I'm just old enough to accept that that's just the deal I made. You know what I mean? But I think that I have a lot of empathy for what he's describing here in evolutionary Marx, that like when you just have 5 factories in town that everybody works for, like I think he's drawing a really clear line to say, hey, this couldn't possibly last. I don't think Marx could even imagine the capitalism that we have today.
That's true.
I really don't think he could even, like, if Marx was like sitting here with me right now, he would just, his brain would just fucking explode.
That's true.
That it's gone so this far. So I don't think Marx is addressing modern day problems, but I do have a lot of empathy for the dialectic that Marx describes between the working class and the ruling class. And I do think we see that today, and I've experienced that in my own life. Do I agree with communism? No, but I think he's more looking at it as, to me, it's more like a natural evolution of things that he's anticipating and planning for. And I don't think Marx is a successful revolutionary at all. But I think as a thinker and somebody who describes a problem, I think he does that really effectively. So there
Couldn't
you
have
go.
said it better myself. I love that.
That actually, like, but here's what's so tough for me, dude. When you frame it like that, I'm like, okay, like I can digest this, and like I can like take some pieces of it that are interesting to think about, and I don't have to like throw the baby out with the bathwater. But when you start saying some of the other things that get talked about, I'm just like, I either start laughing or I just am like, okay, this is stupid. What are you even saying?
Well, that's fair, but like,
I don't know how to close the gap. I don't know how to close the gap between those two
I like
places.
reading a lot of bullshit to try and understand what people are saying and thinking. You know what I mean? Like, I don't look at Marx like a threat. Like, I look at him like a deep, like somebody who's like describing an issue and is attempting to solve a problem that he didn't do successfully for modern times. You know what I mean? Maybe it would have worked globally in 1800. Who knows? But like, I don't look at Marx like a threat. It's like the dude was trying. And like, I think he, like, there's some things he did right and there's some things he did wrong, just like Aristotle, just like everybody else. You know what I mean? Like, fucking, like, he's not Jesus, you know, or whatever, like a Messiah or some shit. You know what I mean? Like, he's just a fucking dude, like, in 1800 trying to anticipate a better future. And like, I don't think he's a villain.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, when you frame it like that, I'm like, yeah, no, I don't think he's a villain either. I think that's a really,
I think he's villainized for sure. You know what I mean? And like, it causes I mean, I love it when you call me a Marxist. It's like, yeah, I emphasize with the struggle of the ruling class. You know what I mean? Like,
one way to square the problem, Howard, like the distinction between something like this, the 10-point program that like is all like really hardly like extremely disagreeable, and then like some of the more foundational stuff, which like
which I can agree, I can like see, maybe not, which I can like
Marx himself, my
with.
point is that Marx himself like hates when he ends up talking this way, when he ends up with the 10-point program. He hates the communist manifesto. He writes later on, he's like, look, it's become a historical document. I can't just like get rid of the parts of it that I don't like. He doesn't want to talk about communism. He wants to just talk about how where capitalism is going, what it's doing well, what it's doing, what the problems
Are you
are.
gonna spend a class doing that where we talk
Next
about
week, I am not the world's greatest interpreter of capital. It's like there's a dude named David Harvey on YouTube. He does like this 20 lecture series, whatever. Yeah, but I want to do capital next week, and with just brief selections of it, which he talks about capitalism in a more sort of like brass tacks way. And I think it's really illuminating because it sort of
I'd be very
reveals
interesting.
it
Yeah, I'd be very
reveals a lot of the
interested in that.
contradictions that we like hold within our heads, that we maybe don't need to, like maybe there's a way out that has a better plan, but whatever. And he doesn't talk about communism. He doesn't get there because he doesn't want to. He's an old man. He's reasoned. He's smart. He's not, he's not silly. And he knows that it's like, why would I make a 10 point, why would I do this like when I was like 30 years old or whatever, and like caused all this trouble. This is pretty silly that I
Yeah.
did that, he like wants to be a serious scholar and like scientist and like dissect capitalism.
Yeah, that's that's super attractive to me. Like, I would love to be able to deconstruct not only capitalism, but some of the like very stalwart assumptions that are kind of like foundational to the way that I look at the world. And
Yeah.
the gap is too large when you start saying.
Well, in a way, you
fucking,
could call yourself a Marxist for wanting to do that, Howard.
that's funny.
Anyway, guys,
That's
I'm gonna end it, and I'll work on next week. We'll do capital. It'll be a great time.
All right.
Thanks,
good night, y'all.
guys.